The photograph album hit the marble floor with a satisfying crack, and my stepsister's scream echoed through the country club's ballroom. These are copies! Worthless copies! I watched from across the room, champagne flute in hand, as Madison tore through the pristine white pages that my mother, our mother now, I suppose, had gifted her at her engagement party. Every single photo was grainy, pixelated, clearly printed from low-resolution scans. My first smile, my first steps, my first day of school, all of them reduced to muddy, barely recognizable images. "I don't understand," Mom stammered, her face draining of color as 200 of the city's elite turned to stare. "I gave you the album from the attic, the original album." "Well, these aren't originals," Madison shrieked, holding up a particularly blurry photo of me at age 3, clutching a stuffed rabbit. "Look at this. You can barely see the details. How am I supposed to use these for the family legacy display at my wedding?" I took another sip of champagne, savoring the moment. The negatives were in a safety deposit box downtown, along with every other irreplaceable piece of my childhood that my mother had tried to erase when she married Madison's father 12 years ago. Because this wasn't my first time living through this moment. 6 months ago, I died in a car accident on the Pacific Coast Highway. I was 28 years old, alone, estranged from my family, working 60-hour weeks at a job I hated just to afford a studio apartment in the worst part of the city. The last thing I remembered before the truck hit me was thinking how hollow my life had become, how I'd let them take everything from me, my childhood, my confidence, my dreams. Then I woke up on the morning of my 16th birthday. I was back in my childhood bedroom, the small one at the end of the hall that Mom had moved me to when Richard and Madison arrived. The wallpaper was the same faded yellow. The bookshelf still held my collection of fantasy novels that Madison would later accidentally donate to Goodwill. And through my window, I could see Mom's garden before she'd dug it up to install Madison's hot tub. At first, I thought it was a dream. Then I realized my hands were smaller, my body different. When I looked in the mirror, I saw my 16-year-old face staring back at me, and I knew with absolute certainty that I'd been given a second chance. In my first life, the next 12 years had been a systematic destruction of everything I was. I'd watched it happen in slow motion, too young and too trusting to understand what was being taken from me until it was already gone. But now, with the memories of a woman who'd lived through it all, who'd spent years in therapy trying to unpack the damage, I could see the patterns before they even began. And I was going to make sure that this time things would be different. The abuse had started subtly, the way it always does in families that look perfect from the outside. My father had died when I was 8, a heart attack, sudden and devastating. Mom had been lost in grief for years, barely functioning, and I'd become the little adult in our house, taking care of her, making sure she ate, holding her hand through the worst nights. Then she met Richard at a grief support group when I was 15. Richard was handsome, charming, and wealthy. Everything my father hadn't been. He owned a chain of luxury car dealerships across the state and lived in a sprawling house in the hills. He seemed genuinely interested in Mom, attentive and patient with her healing process. I'd been happy for her. God, I'd been so stupidly happy. He'd had a daughter from his first marriage. Madison was my age, beautiful in that effortless way that comes from good genetics and better skincare, and she'd hated me on sight. Not openly, of course. Madison was too clever for that. She'd been sweet to my face, calling me sis and suggesting we do our homework together, offering to share her clothes and her friends. But behind closed doors, when it was just the two of us, she'd made it clear that she viewed my mother as competition for her father's affections and me as an unwanted parasite in her perfect life. "Your mom is just a gold digger," she'd hissed at me one night, 3 months after our parents married. We were in her room, the master bedroom that used to be Mom's and mine before Richard had insisted we all move into his house to blend the family properly. My dad has never looked at her the way he looked at my real mom. She's just a placeholder until he gets bored. I'd tried to tell Mom, but Madison was always one step ahead, crying to Richard about how I was having trouble adjusting and saying hurtful things about their relationship. Richard had convinced Mom that I was acting out because I wasn't over my father's death, that I needed therapy, that I needed to try harder to accept their new family. So I'd tried. God, I'd tried so hard. And they'd destroyed me piece by piece. It started with the small things. My bedroom, I'd been moved to the smallest room in the house because Madison needed space for her walk-in closet. My belongings, half of them accidentally broken or lost in the move. My relationship with Mom, systematically undermined by Richard's concerned comments about my troubled behavior and Madison's tearful reports of my supposed cruelty to her. By the time I turned 17, Mom barely looked at me anymore. She'd become Ms. Richard Thornton, living a life of country club luncheons and charity galas, trying desperately to fit into Richard's world. I was an uncomfortable reminder of her old life, her old grief, her old poverty. The college fund my father had left me, the one thing he'd managed to save despite our financial struggles, disappeared into family investments that Richard managed. When I'd asked about it, he'd explained in that patient, patronizing tone that the money was being used more efficiently to ensure my future. That future never materialized. The fund went to Madison's Ivy League education, while I was told that state school would be more appropriate for someone with my grades. My grades, which had plummeted after Madison had started sneaking into my room and tearing pages out of my textbooks, deleting my homework from my laptop, convincing her friends to exclude me from study groups. She'd been careful, always leaving just enough doubt that when I complained, it looked like I was making excuses for my own failures. The photos were one of the cruelest cuts. In my first life, when Madison got engaged at age 23, she'd decided she wanted a family legacy display at her wedding. A beautiful timeline of photos from both families to show how they'd blended into one. Mom had been thrilled at the chance to contribute, to finally be fully accepted by Richard's society friends. She'd given Madison my baby album, not copies, the originals. Every photo my father had taken of me, every memory of my childhood before the nightmare began, handed over to a woman who'd spent years trying to erase me from the family narrative. Madison had used them, of course. But in the display at her wedding, my photos had been mixed in with hers, the captions rewritten to make it ambiguous whose childhood was being shown. My first birthday had become our first birthday. My father had been cropped out of every image, replaced with vague captions about family celebrations. My entire history had been absorbed into hers, rewritten, erased. When I tried to get them back after the wedding, Madison had claimed they'd been lost during the venue cleanup. I'd found out years later through a mutual acquaintance that she'd actually kept them in her house, showing them to friends as her own baby photos. I was such a cute baby, she'd apparently said, pointing to a picture of me at 6 months old. That had been one of the breaking points that led to my estrangement from the family. By the time I was 25, I barely spoke to any of them. I'd missed Madison's baby shower, her housewarming party, every major milestone, and they'd told anyone who asked that I was troubled and unstable, that they'd tried so hard, but I'd rejected their love. I died alone, and they probably hadn't even noticed for weeks. But now, with 12 years of memories and 28 years of life experience, I saw my chance to rewrite the story. The first thing I did after waking up in my 16-year-old body was check the dates. I had 3 months before Mom and Richard's first anniversary, 6 months before Madison would start her campaign to destroy my college prospects, and 8 months before the incident that had ultimately broken my relationship with Mom forever. The second thing I did was go to the attic. It was 3 a.m. and everyone was asleep. I crept up the narrow stairs with a flashlight, my heart pounding, and found the boxes that Mom had packed away when we'd moved, all the remnants of our old life that didn't fit Richard's aesthetic. My father's belongings, our old photo albums, the few pieces of jewelry that had been in our family for generations. The photo album was there, exactly where I remembered. I pulled it out carefully, my hands shaking as I flipped through the pages. There I was, a chubby baby with my father's eyes, a toddler learning to walk, a little girl covered in finger paint and grinning with pure joy. My father was in so many of the photos, young and happy, his love for me obvious in every frame. In my first life, these would be gone in 8 months. This time, I was going to make sure that never happened. I took the album to my room and spent the rest of the night scanning every single photo with the printer-scanner combo that I'd gotten for my 15th birthday. I saved the high-resolution scans to a cloud drive, then to 3 different USB drives that I hid in various places. Then I carefully, methodically replaced each original photo with a printed copy. Decent enough that a casual glance wouldn't notice, but obviously inferior to anyone who looked closely. The negatives, which I found in a shoebox with my father's camera, went into a manila envelope. The next day, I told Mom I was going to the library to study and instead took the bus downtown to the bank where my father had kept his accounts. Using my social security number and his death certificate, which I'd grabbed from Mom's filing cabinet, I was able to access the safety deposit box he'd left in trust for me. It was empty except for a letter he'd written to my 18-year-old self, one I'd never received in my first life because no one had told me about the box. I sat in the private viewing room and read it, tears streaming down my face. "My darling girl," it began. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're finally old enough to access this box. I hope your mother has told you about it, but if not, I'm sorry for the confusion. This box is yours now, a safe place for anything you want to keep protected. I've also included the paperwork for the college fund. Your mother has the main documents, but these are your copies just in case. Never let anyone tell you that money isn't yours. Your education is sacred, and I've made sure it's protected by law. I love you more than all the stars in the sky. Love, Dad." The college fund paperwork was there, notarized and official, clearly stating that the money was held in trust for my education and could not be touched by anyone else. In my first life, Richard had somehow convinced Mom and me that the fund could be reallocated for family investments. I'd been too young to understand the legal protections, too trusting to question him. Not this time. I added the negatives to the box along with the USB drives and the original letter. Then I went home and started phase 2 of my plan, becoming someone they couldn't break. In my first life, I'd been reactive, always on the defense, trying to protect what I had while Madison and Richard took it away. This time, I was going to be proactive. I was going to build a life so solid, so documented, so legally protected that they couldn't touch it. I started with school. I knew Madison's tricks now. I'd lived through them once. When she suggested we study together for the chemistry midterm, I smiled and agreed, but made sure to photograph every page of my notes and homework, time-stamped and backed up to the cloud. When my textbook pages started going missing, I had evidence of what had been there before. When she tried to delete my English essay the night before it was due, I had it saved in 4 different locations and was able to recover it in minutes, instead of the hours of panic and incomplete work that had tanked my grade the first time. I didn't confront her directly. Instead, I went to my teachers and quietly explained that I was having issues with my laptop and wanted to make sure I had backup plans for my assignments. They were understanding, even sympathetic. I became known as a diligent, organized student instead of the scattered, struggling girl I'd been before. My grades climbed from C's to A's within 2 months. Madison noticed, of course. She started working harder to sabotage me, but I was always one step ahead because I'd already lived through her playbook. When she spread rumors that I was cheating, I had timestamped documentation of all my work. When she tried to get me excluded from the academic decathlon team, the faculty advisor had already seen my improved performance and advocated for me. The harder she tried to destroy me, the more it backfired. By the time I turned 17, I was junior class president, captain of the debate team, and had a 4.0 GPA. I'd also started documenting everything happening at home, not just for my own records, but building a case I hoped I'd never need to use. The college fund confrontation came 2 weeks after my 17th birthday. I was ready for it. I'd spent months researching trust law, making copies of all the paperwork, even consulting with a lawyer through my school's free legal aid program. When Richard called me into his office and explained that he'd been managing my father's legacy and that the money had been reinvested for better returns, I didn't cry or argue like I had the first time. Instead, I pulled out my copies of the trust documents and asked him to explain exactly which legal provisions allowed him to move money that was legally designated for my education into his personal investment accounts. His face had gone white, then red. "Your mother and I are your legal guardians. We make the financial decisions." "The trust was set up to be untouchable by guardians," I said calmly, pointing to the relevant clause. "It's not part of your marital assets. It's mine, held in trust until I turn 18 or need it for qualified educational expenses. If you've moved it, that's illegal." "Are you threatening me?" His voice was low, dangerous. This was the Richard that Madison and I saw behind closed doors, the one who never appeared around Mom. "I'm asking questions about my father's money," I replied. If the money is where it's supposed to be, you'll be able to show me the account statements. If it's not, we have a problem. He'd blustered and threatened, but I'd held firm. The next day, Mom had called me into the living room for a family meeting, where Richard and Madison sat on one couch while I sat alone on the other, 3 against 1, exactly like I remembered. Richard says you've been very disrespectful, Mom said. She wouldn't meet my eyes. After everything he's done for us, providing this beautiful home, giving you opportunities, I want to see my college fund statements, I interrupted by saying. That's not disrespectful. That's my legal right as the beneficiary. The money is being properly managed, Richard said smoothly as there's no need for you to worry about financial matters. Then showing me the statements should be easy. Madison jumped in, her eyes wide and innocent. Why are you being so paranoid? Dad's literally a financial professional. He manages millions of dollars. He's trying to help you. Then he can help me by providing documentation. The meeting had gone in circles, but I'd planted the seed. I'd also sent a certified letter to the trustee bank that held the fund, requesting statements and confirmation that no unauthorized transfers had occurred. Richard had been furious when the bank had contacted him to verify the request, but there was nothing he could do without revealing that he'd already been moving money around. The fund was frozen pending investigation. I'd saved it, barely, but the damage to my relationship with Mom was severe. She'd stopped speaking to me except when necessary. Madison had launched a full campaign of playing the victim, crying to anyone who would listen about how I'd accused her father of being a thief and torn the family apart with my paranoia. At school, her friends had started spreading rumors that I was mentally unstable, that I'd been violent at home, that my family was afraid of me. It had been brutal, but I'd weathered it. I'd learned in my first life how to survive with no support system, and this time I had something I hadn't had before, the knowledge that I was right, that I was protecting myself, and that in the long run, the truth would matter. Plus, I documented everything, every conversation, every incident, dated and backed up. I'd started seeing the school counselor regularly, not because I needed it. Therapy in my first life had taught me good coping mechanisms, but because I needed an adult authority figure who could testify to my mental state and the situation at home if it ever came to that. I'd also started working. I'd gotten a job at a local bookstore, lying about my age by 6 months to qualify. The money wasn't much, but it was mine, and I was saving every penny. I'd opened a bank account at a different bank than Richard used, one where he couldn't sweet-talk the managers into giving him information about my finances. By the time I graduated high school at 18, I had a full academic scholarship to a prestigious university 3 hours away, $8,000 in savings, and a college fund that had been legally protected from Richard's schemes. I also had 4 years of documentation showing a pattern of emotional abuse, financial manipulation, and systematic sabotage. I'd left home the day after graduation and never looked back. Unlike my first life, where I'd been pushed out, broke, and desperate, this time I left on my own terms, with resources and a plan. I'd cut contact with Mom, Richard, and Madison completely. When they tried to reach out, and they had sporadically, usually when they wanted something, I'd ignored them. College was different this time, too. I wasn't working 2 jobs to afford rent while taking classes. I wasn't emotionally destroyed and desperate for any scrap of affection. I was focused, driven, and I'd used my foreknowledge to position myself perfectly. I'd majored in business instead of the English degree I'd pursued the first time, and I'd made connections with professors and fellow students who would become important in my industry. I'd invested my savings carefully, using knowledge of which startups would succeed over the next decade. By the time I was 22, I'd turned that $8,000 into $200,000. By 25, I was a millionaire. I'd started my own consulting firm, helping small businesses optimize their operations and marketing. I'd used every hard lesson from my first life, every failure and setback, to build something successful. I'd also made a point of being generous with my success, funding scholarships for kids from broken homes, donating to domestic abuse charities, building the support network I'd never had. And I'd waited. I knew that eventually Madison would get engaged. I knew that she'd want the photos. I knew that Mom, desperate to be included in Madison's perfect life, would offer them up like a sacrifice to prove her love. I'd waited 6 years for this moment. The engagement announcement had come last month. Madison was marrying Brent Ashworth, the son of a real estate mogul, in what she was already calling the wedding of the century. She'd posted about it constantly on social media, and I'd watched from afar as she'd planned her perfect day. Then 3 weeks ago, I'd gotten a text from an unknown number. It was Mom. Madison would like some family photos for her wedding display. Do you have any copies of your baby pictures? It would mean so much to her to include you in the family celebration. I'd stared at that text for a long time. Include me in the family celebration. As if I were the one who'd rejected them rather than the daughter they'd systematically destroyed. I'd typed and deleted a dozen responses before settling on, I have my father's negatives in a safe place. The prints in the attic are just copies I made years ago. Do whatever you want with them. I'd known exactly what would happen. Mom would find the album, wouldn't look too closely at the quality because she'd never really looked at me closely anyway, and would gift them to Madison with all the ceremony of a peace offering. And Madison, who'd wanted the original specifically so she could continue her fiction of being me, would discover that she'd been given worthless copies. Now, standing in the country club ballroom, I watched the revelation play out exactly as I'd anticipated. How could you not know they were copies? Madison was shrieking at Mom, who'd started to cry. These are useless. I told you I needed originals for the professional display. These look like they were printed on a home printer. I didn't know, Mom sobbed. They were in the album in the attic. I thought... You thought? You didn't even check? Madison threw the album down again, and several guests gasped as photos scattered across the marble floor. This is exactly why Dad says you're so thoughtless. You ruin everything. Richard stepped in, putting his arm around Madison. Sweetheart, calm down. We'll figure this out. How? Madison's face was splotchy and red, her carefully applied makeup running with angry tears. The wedding is in 3 months. I already told the display company the photos were antique originals. Do you know how stupid I'm going to look if I have to use these? Maybe we can get the originals from... Mom trailed off, and I saw her eyes scan the room, looking for someone who wasn't there. Looking for me. From who? Madison demanded. From your daughter, who you haven't spoken to in 6 years? The one who made it very clear she wants nothing to do with this family? I took that as my cue. I set down my champagne flute and walked across the ballroom, my heels clicking on the marble. I'd dressed carefully for tonight. Designer dress, perfect hair, the kind of polished elegance that came from money and confidence. I looked like I belonged here in this world of old money and older grudges. Hello, Mother, I said. Mom's head jerked up, her eyes widening. Olivia? It's been a while, I agreed. I looked at Madison, who was staring at me with her mouth open, the album forgotten in her hands. Hi, Madison, congratulations on your engagement. What are you doing here? Madison's voice was sharp, suspicious. Brent's mother invited me. I smiled. We sit on the board of the Children's Advocacy Center together. She's told me so much about you. That was true. Mrs. Ashworth and I had become friends over the past 2 years through our charity work, though I'd never mentioned my connection to her future daughter-in-law. She knew I came from a difficult family background. I'd been open about that in my advocacy work, but I'd never named names. Until 2 weeks ago, when I'd casually mentioned that I'd lost touch with my stepsister and her fiancé's name. Mrs. Ashworth had been surprised and delighted to learn we were connected and had immediately invited me to the engagement party as a wonderful surprise. I'd accepted. You sit on a board? Mom looked confused, as if she couldn't reconcile the idea of me, her troubled daughter, being in the same social circles as Richard's chosen people. Several, actually. I pulled out my phone, pulling up a photo. I had these restored professionally a few years ago, scanned from the original negatives. Would you like to see? I held out the screen, showing a high-resolution image of me at age 2, sitting on my father's lap, both of us laughing. The detail was incredible. You could see the pattern on my dress, the titles of the books on the shelf behind us, the love in my father's eyes. Madison snatched the phone from my hand, swiping through the photos. Her face went from red to white. "Where did you get these?" "They're mine," I said simply. "My father took them. I've had them since I was 16. "You knew?" Madison's voice was rising again. "You knew Mom was going to give me copies and you didn't say anything?" "You asked my mother for my baby photos to use in your wedding display," I said, my voice calm and clear enough that nearby guests could hear every word. "Photos of me from my childhood with my father? You didn't ask my permission. You didn't even tell me you wanted them. Why would I volunteer information about what I'd done with my own property?" "Because we're family," Madison spat. "Are we?" I tilted my head. "Because I remember you telling me multiple times that I was just the gold digger's kid and that I didn't belong in your father's house. I remember you spending 4 years making sure I knew exactly how unwelcome I was." "That's not, I never—" Madison looked at her father, at Mom, at the crowd that was watching with rapt attention. "She's lying. I was always nice to her. She was the one who was jealous and bitter." "Were you nice when you tore pages out of my textbooks, Spank?" I asked. "Or when you deleted my college application essays the night before they were due? Or when you told everyone at school that I was stealing from your family?" "You're insane," Madison said, but her voice wavered. "I have documentation," I said. "I started keeping records when I was 16. Dates, times, witnesses where available. I also have the photos, all of them, professionally restored and properly stored. The negatives are in a safe place, William Les Hamas, along with several other items from my childhood that went missing over the years." I looked at Mom, who'd gone pale. "You gave her an album of low-quality copies that I made when I was 16 because I knew, even then, that nothing I valued was safe in that house. I took the originals and protected them, just like I protected my college fund when Richard tried to steal it." "Steal?" Richard's voice was dangerous. "That's a serious accusation." "It's a factual statement," I replied. "You attempted to illegally transfer money from a protected trust fund. I have the bank records and the letter from the trustee confirming that you'd made multiple unauthorized withdrawal attempts. Would you like me to share them?" The silence in the ballroom was absolute. Every eye was on us, and I could see the calculations happening in Richard's head. He was a businessman, a social climber. A scandal about illegal trust fund manipulation would destroy him in these circles. "This is ridiculous," he said finally. "You're disrupting your sister's engagement party with these delusions." "She's not my sister," I said clearly. "She's my former stepsister. We haven't been family since I turned 18 and left your house." As for disruption, I looked at the scattered photos on the floor, at Madison's tear-stained face, at the guests who were now whispering to each other. I think that was already accomplished before I got here. Mrs. Ashworth appeared at my elbow, her face concerned. "Olivia, dear, is everything all right?" "Everything's fine, Patricia," I said, squeezing her hand. "Just a misunderstanding about some old photos. Madison wanted to use pictures of me in her wedding display without asking, and she's disappointed to learn that she only has access to copies." "Oh." Patricia looked at Madison with new eyes. "Madison, dear, if you wanted family photos, you should have asked Olivia directly. That would have been the proper thing to do." "I didn't think she'd—" Madison stopped, realizing she was about to admit she'd expected to take my photos without permission. "I'd be happy to provide some images for your display," I said generously. "Professional quality scans from the original negatives. For a fee, of course. Let's say $10,000. That's quite reasonable for such rare, irreplaceable images." Madison's mouth fell open. $10,000? For pictures of you? "For pictures that you want to use without my permission," I corrected. "Or you could leave me out of your display entirely. I'm sure you have plenty of your own childhood photos to use. Unless—" I paused, pretending to think. "Oh, wait. Didn't you tell your college roommate that you were an only child? I'm sure that would make for an interesting conversation with your future in-laws if it came up." Patricia frowned. "Madison, you told people you were an only child?" I I meant that I was my mother's only child, Madison stammered. It's complicated. It's really not, I said. My mother married her father when we were teenagers. We never got along. She made my life miserable, so when I turned 18, I left and never looked back. Now she wants to use my childhood photos to create a false narrative of family unity for her wedding. That's actually pretty simple. That's not what happened. Madison turned to the crowd, desperate. She was always so difficult. She refused to accept our family. She made everything about her dead father. Don't, I said, my voice cutting through hers like ice. Don't you dare talk about my father. Something in my tone must have been frightening because Madison actually took a step back. My father loved me, I continued, my voice steady despite the emotion building in my chest. He took those photos because every moment with me was precious to him. He died when I was 8, and those images are all I have left of him. You wanted to take them, crop him out, and pretend they were yours. You wanted to erase him the same way you tried to erase me. Tears were running down my face now, but I didn't care. You can have copies for free, Madison. Crappy, low-resolution copies that you can barely see. That's all you deserve. The originals, the negatives, the high-quality scans, those are mine. They'll always be mine. And when I have children someday, I'll show them pictures of their grandfather, and they'll know that he existed, that he loved me, that he was real. You can't take that away from me. Not again. The ballroom was silent except for my breathing and Mom's quiet sobs. I think, Patricia said gently, that perhaps this party should end early. Madison, dear, why don't you and your father take your mother home? Olivia, would you like to step outside for some air? I nodded, letting her guide me toward the terrace. As I walked past Mom, she reached out to touch my arm. Olivia, wait, I didn't know. Yes, you did, I said, looking at her directly for the first time in 6 years. Maybe not about the photos specifically, but you knew what they did to me. You knew, and you chose them. You chose your new life, your new husband, your new stepdaughter. You chose to believe them when they said I was the problem. So don't tell me you didn't know. I'm your mother, she whispered. No, I said softly. You were my mother, past tense. You gave that up when you gave my baby pictures to her without even asking me first. I walked away, and this time, I didn't look back. Patricia took me to a quiet corner of the terrace and handed me a glass of water. I had no idea, she said. Madison and Richard have always presented such a united family front. Your mother always seemed so devoted to them. She is devoted to them, I said, wiping my eyes. That's the problem. How long has it been since you spoke to them? 6 years. I left the day after high school graduation and never went back. Patricia was quiet for a moment, studying me. You've built quite a life for yourself in that time. I had to. There was no one else to do it for me. The Children's Advocacy Center is lucky to have you. You're our most effective advocate. You speak about these issues with such passion and insight. Personal experience, I said wryly. I'm beginning to understand that. Patricia hesitated. I'm going to be honest with you, Olivia. Brent has expressed some concerns about Madison. Nothing major, but small things. The way she speaks about service workers, her attitude toward his friends who aren't as wealthy. I've been dismissing it as wedding stress, but now you're wondering what else you don't know about her. Yes. I considered my next words carefully. This was a delicate moment, one that could determine Madison's future. The old me, the one from my first life, would have jumped at the chance to sabotage her wedding. But I'd learned something in my second chance at life. The best revenge wasn't destroying someone else. It was building something so good, so solid, that they couldn't touch it. Patricia, I won't tell you what to think about Madison. That's between you and your son. But I will tell you this. She's spent her entire life getting everything she wants by manipulating the people around her. She's very good at playing the victim, at making people believe that anyone who stands up to her is the problem. If Brent has concerns, he should trust his instincts, and you should trust yours. Patricia nodded slowly. Thank you for your honesty. Thank you for inviting me tonight, I said. I didn't come here to cause a scene, but I'm not sorry it happened. They needed to know that I'm not that scared 16-year-old anymore. I'm not someone they can push around. No, Patricia agreed, a small smile playing at her lips. You're certainly not. We talked for a while longer, and Patricia shared that Brent had actually been having doubts about the engagement for weeks. Madison's spending habits, her constant need for validation, her tendency to throw tantrums when things didn't go exactly her way, all of it had been building. Tonight had been the first time Patricia had seen it in action, and it clearly troubled her. I can't make decisions for my son, she said finally, but I can make sure he has all the information he needs. I left the party shortly after, but not before the incident became the talk of the evening. I'd made sure of it by being calm, factual, and letting Madison's behavior speak for itself. I hadn't had to destroy her reputation. She'd done it herself by throwing a tantrum over photos at her own engagement party. The next morning, I woke up to 17 missed calls and 23 texts. Most were from unknown numbers, but 3 were from Mom. Please call me, the first one read. We need to talk. I'm sorry for what happened. Please let me explain. Olivia, you're my daughter. I love you. Please. I stared at that last text for a long time. Part of me wanted to believe it, wanted to think that maybe, finally, she understood what she'd done. But I remembered too well what had happened in my first life when I'd accepted her apologies, let her back in. It had always ended the same way, with me hurt and her choosing Richard and Madison over me again. I deleted the texts and blocked the numbers. The calls from friends and colleagues were more interesting. Apparently, the story of the engagement party confrontation had spread through our social circles overnight. Several people wanted to know if I was okay, if I needed anything. A few were clearly fishing for gossip, but most seemed genuinely concerned. Patricia called around noon. I wanted to let you know that Brent has postponed the wedding. My heart skipped. Postponed? Indefinitely. After the party, they had a long conversation about Madison's behavior. She apparently told him that you'd always been jealous of her, that you'd orchestrated the entire scene to embarrass her. When he asked her to explain why you'd said the things you did, she couldn't give him a straight answer. Just kept insisting you were lying. And he believed me? He believed that there was something wrong when his fiancée threw a tantrum over photos at an engagement party, Patricia said dryly. The details about your history were just confirmation that he'd been right to have doubts. He's taking some time to think about whether this is really the relationship he wants. I sat down, stunned. I didn't mean to. You didn't break them up, Olivia. You just shone a light on who Madison really is. What Brent does with that information is his choice. After I hung up, I sat in my apartment for a long time processing. This hadn't happened in my first life because I hadn't been at that engagement party. I'd been uninvited. Persona non grata, living in a tiny apartment and working a job I hated. Madison had married Brent on schedule, and they'd had 2 children before divorcing 5 years later in a spectacular fashion involving his mistress and her cocaine habit. But that was the old timeline. This was new. My phone buzzed again. This time it was an unknown number with a message that made my blood run cold. You're going to regret what you did. You've always been ungrateful, and now you're trying to ruin Madison's life out of pure spite. We took you in, gave you everything, and this is how you repay us? We should have left you and your mother in that tiny house, struggling and poor. Richard saved you both, and you repay him with lies and accusations. You're going to pay for this. It wasn't signed, but I knew Richard's writing style. I'd seen enough of his angry emails in my first life. I screenshotted the text and forwarded it to my lawyer. Yes, I had a lawyer now, a good one, with a note. Document this, I want a paper trail. Then I did something I'd been putting off for years. I opened up the secure folder on my laptop and pulled out all the documentation I'd compiled about my childhood. Every incident, every piece of evidence, every witness statement I'd collected. It was hundreds of pages, meticulously organized. I'd never wanted to use it. Despite everything, part of me had hoped that just walking away, just building my own life would be enough, but Richard's text made it clear that they weren't going to let me go. They were going to try to destroy me again, and this time they had more resources and connections to do it. So I did what I'd learned to do. I went on the offensive. I called my lawyer and told her I wanted to file a formal complaint about Richard's attempted theft of my trust fund. The statute of limitations hadn't run out, and I had all the evidence. I also wanted to explore options for a restraining order based on the threatening text. Then I called a friend who worked in public relations. I need advice, I said. Asa, someone is threatening me, and they have the social connections to make my life difficult. How do I protect myself? Her answer was simple. Control the narrative. Tell your story before they can spin it. So I did. I wrote a piece for a major publication about growing up in a blended family where you're not wanted, about the subtle and not so subtle ways that family members can abuse a child while maintaining a perfect public image. I didn't name names, but I was specific about the types of abuse: the financial manipulation, the sabotage of schoolwork, the erasure of a dead parent's memory. I wrote about leaving at 18, about building a life from nothing, about using my experiences to help other children in similar situations through my advocacy work. The piece went viral. Suddenly, I was being invited to speak on panels, to give interviews, to share my expertise. People who'd grown up in blended families reached out to tell me their own stories, to thank me for putting words to experiences they'd thought were unique. And then the other shoe dropped. 3 weeks after the article was published, I got a call from a reporter. Ms. Cooper, I'm writing a follow-up piece about family dynamics in wealthy families. Several sources have told me that your article was about your stepfather, Richard Thornton, and stepsister, Madison Thornton. Would you care to comment? I'd known this was coming. I don't comment on specific individuals, I said carefully. My article was about common patterns in blended families, not any one situation. But you did grow up in Richard Thornton's house, didn't you? I did. My mother married Richard when I was 15. I left at 18. And the incidents you described in your article, the stolen trust fund, the sabotage schoolwork, those happened in his house? I described patterns that happen in many households, I said. If readers think they recognize specific situations, that says more about how common these patterns are than about any individual family. The reporter persisted, but I held firm. I wasn't going to be the one to publicly name them. I was going to let the evidence speak for itself. The article came out 2 days later. The reporter had done her homework. She'd interviewed former classmates, teachers, even some of Richard's business associates. The picture she painted was damning, a family that looked perfect from the outside but was rotten at its core. She'd also obtained copies of the trust fund documentation through a Freedom of Information request. Apparently, there had been enough of a legal case that it had become part of public record. The article included direct quotes from the bank's letter confirming that Richard had attempted unauthorized withdrawals. Richard's reputation in his social circles began to crumble. Several of his business partners started quietly distancing themselves. The country club, where he'd been a member for years, suddenly found irregularities in his membership renewal. Mom called me, crying, "How could you do this to us? We're being destroyed." "I didn't name you in anything," I said coldly. "I told my story. If people recognize you in it, that's because of what you did, not because of what I said." "But everyone knows now. Everyone is talking about us." "Good. Maybe the next teenage girl who comes into your house will be warned. There is no next girl. Richard and we're having problems. He blames me for not controlling you. Madison won't speak to me. Brent called off the engagement entirely. My life is falling apart." And there it was. After everything, after all the years of choosing them over me, she was upset that her new family was falling apart. Not that she'd hurt me. Not that she'd failed me as a mother. Just that her comfortable life was disappearing. "Mom," I said, and my voice was surprisingly gentle, "you had a choice. Every day, for 6 years, you had a choice. You chose Richard and Madison. You chose their lies over my truth. You chose their comfort over my safety. This isn't happening to you because of what I did. It's happening because of what you allowed to happen to me." "I didn't know it was that bad," she sobbed. "Yes, you did. You just didn't want to see it." I hung up and blocked her number. The fallout continued for months. Richard's car dealership started losing business as word spread about his character. Madison's social media, which had been full of aspirational lifestyle content, went dark after the engagement ended. She'd apparently moved back in with Richard, unable to afford her apartment without Brent's support. The trust fund case went to court and I won. Not only did I get confirmation that Richard had attempted illegal transfers, but I was awarded damages for emotional distress and legal fees. The amount wasn't huge, $50,000, but it was the principle. It was official legal acknowledgement that what he'd done was wrong. I donated the entire amount to a scholarship fund for kids leaving abusive homes. My business continued to grow. My advocacy work expanded. I started a nonprofit specifically focused on helping teenagers in blended family situations document abuse and protect their assets. I called it the Second Chance Foundation, a private joke about my own second chance at life that no one else would ever understand. On my 26th birthday, 2 years after the engagement party incident, I received a letter from Mom. I almost didn't open it, but curiosity got the better of me. Dear Olivia, it began. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even know if I can forgive myself. Richard and I are divorced. I finally saw what you've been trying to tell me for years. He was manipulating me, using me, and I was so desperate to feel loved and secure after your father died that I let him. I let him hurt you to keep my illusion of a perfect family. The letter went on for pages. She'd moved back to our old neighborhood, was living in a small apartment, working as a secretary. She'd started therapy. She'd realized too late that she'd thrown away the only family that mattered, me, for people who'd never really loved her at all. Madison never calls, she wrote. Richard remarried 6 months after our divorce. He's already erasing me from his life the same way he erased you. I understand now, I understand everything, and I am so, so sorry. I read the letter 3 times, then put it in a drawer. A month later, I wrote back. Not a long letter, just a short note. Mom, I appreciate your apology. I believe that you're sorry, and I believe that you understand now what you didn't understand before, but understanding doesn't undo the damage. I spent years trying to get you to see, trying to make you choose me, and you didn't. I can't go backward. I've built a life without you, and it's a good life. I'm happy. I don't think there's room in it for people who had to lose everything before they could see what they had. I hope you find peace, and I hope you make better choices in the future. But I can't be part of your healing journey. I'm sorry. I never heard from her again after that, though I occasionally heard through mutual acquaintances that she was doing okay, that she'd stayed in therapy, that she'd been to a few Al-Anon meetings, even though Richard wasn't an alcoholic. She'd just needed the support system for dealing with her own codependency and manipulation. I hoped she found what she needed. I really did. But it couldn't be with me. Madison, on the other hand, didn't go so quietly. 3 years after the engagement party, when I was 27, happy, successful, and completely over the need for revenge, she showed up at my office. My assistant buzzed me. There's a Madison Thornton here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment. I considered having her thrown out, but curiosity once again won out. Send her in. Madison looked different. Thinner, older, tired. The polish I remembered was gone, replaced with something more desperate. What do you want? I asked, not unkindly, but not warmly either. I want to apologize, she said, sitting down without being invited. For everything, for what I did when we were kids. For the photos, for all of it. I leaned back in my chair, studying her. Okay. That's it? Just okay? What do you want me to say, Madison? That I forgive you? That we can be sisters now? I don't know. She looked down at her hands. Everything fell apart after that engagement party. Brent left me. My dad barely speaks to me anymore because I reminded him too much of his failures with your mom. I've been working retail for 2 years. I had to sell my car. I'm living with a roommate in a terrible part of town. I'm sorry you're struggling, I said, and meant it. But that's not my fault. I know it's not. I did this to myself. She looked up and there were tears in her eyes. I was so jealous of you. Of me? You had everything. No, I had stuff. You had love. Your mom loved you so completely. Even after my dad came into the picture. Your father, from the stories I heard, from those photos, he loved you so much. And I had my dad, who only cared about appearances and success. He loved me when I was perfect, when I was making him look good. But you were loved unconditionally, and I hated you for it. I was quiet for a long moment. In my first life, I'd never gotten this confession. Madison had died, ironically, in the same car accident that had killed me 6 months earlier. We'd both been driving on the same highway in the same storm, two unhappy women who'd once been family ending up in the same tragic place. But this was the new timeline. This was different. Madison, I said carefully, I appreciate your apology. I even believe it. But an apology doesn't undo what happened. It doesn't give me back the years I spent being afraid in my own home. It doesn't restore my relationship with my mother. It doesn't make us family. I know. And I've moved on. I've built a life that doesn't include the people who hurt me. I'm happy now, really happy. And I need to protect that happiness. I understand. She stood up. I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry. And that you were right. About all of it. About my dad, about everything. You deserved better. Yes, I agreed. I did. She left and I never saw her again. But I heard through the grapevine that she'd started therapy too, that she'd gone back to school, gotten a degree in social work, and was working with at-risk youth, that she'd changed her name, distancing herself from the Thornton legacy, and was trying to build something real. I hoped she succeeded. I really did, because in the end, the best revenge wasn't destroying the people who'd hurt me. It was building something so good, so solid, so full of genuine love and success that their actions became irrelevant. Now, at 28, the age I'd been when I died in my first life, I stood in my beautiful apartment overlooking the city, surrounded by friends who actually cared about me, running a business I loved and a nonprofit that helped hundreds of kids every year. I had photos of my father on every wall, and I'd recently started dating someone kind who listened when I talked about my past without judgment. My life wasn't perfect. I still had nightmares sometimes about the years in Richard's house. I still flinched when people raised their voices. I still had trust issues and probably always would. But I was happy, and I was free. And those baby photos, the ones my mother had tried to give away, the ones Madison had wanted to steal, were framed in my hallway, the negatives safely stored for the children I might have someday. My father's face smiled out at me every morning, and sometimes I'd stand there and tell him about my day, about the life I'd built, about the second chance I'd been given. I did it, Dad, I whispered to his picture. I saved myself. And I saved you too, your memory, your love, everything you gave me. No one can take that away now. And as I stood there, surrounded by the evidence of my survival and success, I realized that this was the real victory. Not that I'd exposed Richard's crimes, or ruined Madison's engagement, or made my mother regret her choices. The real victory was that I'd taken the broken pieces of a destroyed childhood and built something beautiful. I'd taken the worst thing that ever happened to me and used it to help other people. I'd taken photos that someone tried to steal and turned them into a daily reminder that I was loved, that I mattered, that I deserved all the good things I'd built. That was the best revenge of all. Living well, loving myself, and knowing that no matter what they'd tried to take from me, they'd failed. Because I'd already taken back everything that mattered, and this time I'd kept the negatives.